deep in the night. Inside the princely chambers, it is dead quiet. A man, whose very name strikes terror from Novgorod to Kyiv, is fast asleep. Suddenly, he opens his eyes, only to see a drawn knife hovering directly over his chest. The person who has come to slit his throat is none other than his own wife. Her name was Rogneda. In the historical chronicles, she remains little more than a shadow, a war trophy claimed on the smoldering ashes of her home. Her father and brothers were slaughtered right before her eyes, and the young princess herself was dragged by force into Vladimir's sprawling harem, a place where hundreds of other captive women already lived. It would seem that no one could survive such trauma. Yet it was this very woman, stripped of her home and her family, who dared to take a step that not a single armor-clad warlord ever had the courage to make. How did it come to pass that a captive prisoner raised the future ruler of Kyiv and Rus, Yaroslav the Wise? And why did her desperate act of rebellion, coinciding with the religious fanaticism of the Kievan mob, force the Grand Prince to abandon his ancient gods forever? It all started with just a single phrase, carelessly thrown at a group of matchmakers, words that ultimately cost an entire Polotsk noble dynasty their lives. Then, the brutal law of the 10th century kicked into gear. Foreign lands were taken exclusively by the right of the sword, and once that mechanism was set in motion, it could no longer be stopped. It would go so far that right in the heart of Kyiv, a blind lot would fall upon a veteran Varangian warrior and his son, and this human sacrifice would fracture their society once and for all. Our journey will begin on the blood-drenched streets of wealthy Polotsk, and it will end on that one fateful night when a young boy, holding a child's wooden training sword in his hands, forces a grown, battle-hardened ruler to lower his weapon. The vast majority of these details have come down to us from chronicles written 130 years after the actual events. The monk scribes diligently smoothed over the rough edges, hiding the visceral violence behind theological metaphors. But if we strip away the religious outer shell, an entirely different picture is revealed. This is a testament to how a regime that relies solely on fear and brute force eventually begins to devour itself. Vladimir truly believed that by seizing lands and slaughtering the families of his enemies, he was cementing his own greatness. In reality, he was setting off a chain reaction of vengeance that would one day force his own sons to raise their weapons against their father. This is what an era looks like when marriages were sealed by the flames of burning cities, and a state was forged out of pure hatred. I am waiting for your approval to move on to writing the first module. Polotsk, the Pearl of the Dvina. The year is 980, the Western Dvina. The dark waters of this mighty river served as the superhighways of the era, connecting the freezing northern seas with the wealthy southern empires. In the 10th century, geography dictated clear, unforgiving rules. Whoever controlled the channels of the great rivers controlled the power. It was precisely here that the city of Polotsk stood tall. We are accustomed to thinking of Kyiv and Novgorod as the main political centers of that era. But in those years, Polotsk spoke to its neighbors on completely equal terms. Cloudy, yellowish amber from the shores of the Baltic Sea flowed heavily into this city. Precious furs were brought in from the deep forests, goods that would sell for their weight in pure silver in the bustling markets of Constantinople. Here, too, there was a brisk and thriving trade in the most sought-after commodity of the early Middle Ages, human beings. The slave markets operated without interruption, making the city fabulously wealthy and fiercely independent. The master of all these riches was a man who had come from across the sea. The Slavic chronicles remember him as Rogvolod, while his war band called him Jarl Ragnvald. He paid absolutely no tribute to either the Kievan or the Novgorodian princes. Rogvolod had built his principality relying exclusively on heavy steel blades and silver, and he personally dictated the customs duties to anyone whose trade caravans dared to pass by his shores. But the Jarl's greatest political resource remained his daughter. The Slavs knew her as Rogneda. Her Scandinavian kin called her Ragnhild. A ruler's daughter in the harsh realities of the 10th century was a paramount geopolitical instrument. A dynastic marriage meant the unification of armies, a strict monopoly over the river portages, and a guarantee of non-aggression. Rogneda grew up in a world where human destinies were weighed on the exact same folding scales as chopped-up Arabic silver coins. She knew her own worth, and because of that, a genuine battle unfolded for her hand in marriage. At this time, Rus was being torn apart by a vicious civil war. Sitting in Kyiv was Yaropolk, the legitimate heir, fully supported by the old established elite. Meanwhile, in the north, Vladimir was gathering his strength. Having been forced to flee from the wrath of his older brother some time ago, he had returned from across the sea with a massive army of Scandinavian mercenaries who were thirsting for plunder. The country was split in two. Polotsk was the exact piece that would inevitably tip the scales. Whichever of the two brothers managed to secure Rogvolod as an ally would guarantee his own troops a steady supply line along the Dvina and would be able to strike the enemy in an unprotected flank. Matchmakers from both princes arrived at Rogvolod's court. It was an incredibly rare situation. The old Jarl was granted the actual power of choice. 130 years later, a monk chronicler sitting in a quiet cell would reduce this immensely complex diplomatic game to mere maidenly arrogance. In reality, the court of Polotsk engaged in a cold, calculating political strategy. On one side stood the legitimate Kievan prince, backed by the wealthy south and a well-oiled, functional system of tribute collection. On the other side stood a bastard, the son of a housekeeper, whose entire power rested solely on a horde of foreigners demanding heavy payment for every single march. Rogvolod and Rogneda placed their bets on stability, choosing Kyiv. All that was left for the young woman was to deliver the official refusal to Vladimir's ambassadors. In rejecting the suitor, she was absolutely certain she was orchestrating high politics. At that moment, it seemed that the towering oak walls of Polotsk and the heavy battle axes of her father's warband would reliably shield her from any possible consequences. But banking on legitimate authority turned out to be a fatal mistake. The words the young princess would say to the ambassadors would not simply insult Vladimir. They would hand his hardened mercenaries the long-awaited pretext to bring all their unbridled fury crashing down upon Polotsk. One phrase, just a few words, and an entire princely dynasty would be slaughtered down to the very root. Standing before Rogvolod in the spacious timber palace of Polotsk, the Novgorodian ambassadors ask for Rogneda's hand on behalf of their young leader, Prince Vladimir. For Vladimir, this marriage is absolutely not a matter of passion, but rather dry, ruthless geopolitical calculation. He desperately needs a secure rear and total control over the western Dvina for his final push towards Kyiv, where his ultimate enemy sits, his older brother, Yaropolk. The decision is not made by Rogvolod alone. The chronicle has preserved a moment that is exceedingly rare for the early Middle Ages. The old Jarl publicly asks his daughter, "Do you wish to marry Vladimir?" And Rogneda answers. Her voice rings out loud and clear, ensuring the entire war band and the ambassadors hear every syllable. I do not wish to take off the shoes of a slave's son, but I want Yaropolk. The monks who compiled the chronicles a century later frequently interpreted this scene as maidenly haughtiness, claiming she doomed her family all because of the whim of a spoiled princess. However, to a person living in the 10th century, something entirely different is being communicated here. This is not a whim. It is a flawlessly calculated, lethal political strike. Let's start with the taking off the shoes. In the Eastern Slavic tradition, there was an archaic wedding ritual. A young wife, as a sign of absolute submission, would remove the footwear from her new husband's feet. But Rogneda is not a Slav. The blood of northern Jarls courses through her veins. For the Scandinavian nobility, the marriage ritual looked radically different. Equal partners would exchange ancestral swords and oaths, cementing a military alliance. The mere demand to perform a foreign, Slavic ritual of subjection sounded profoundly insulting to a proud Scandinavian noblewoman. But the real core of the insult is hidden in the very next word, Robicic, the son of a slave. Rogneda strikes at Vladimir's absolute most vulnerable point, his lineage. The prince's mother, Malusha, had served as the housekeeper for Princess Olga. Now, by the standards of harsh Scandinavian law, the children of concubines were granted absolutely legitimate rights to the throne, provided the father officially acknowledged them. The great warrior Prince Sviatoslav had recognized his son and placed him to rule in Novgorod, making Vladimir a full and equal contender for the Kievan throne. However, in the eyes of the old aristocracy, who fiercely boasted of the purity of their bloodlines going back many generations, he remained a bastard, a half-breed, with the indelible brand of slave origins. The Polotsk court had made its political bet, choosing Yaropolk, the lawful, indisputable heir currently sitting in the capital. In order to prove their absolute loyalty to Kyiv, Rogvolod needed to do more than simply refuse the Novgorodians. He needed to burn the bridges entirely. Rogneda's refusal rang out as a very public slap in the face, a political declaration that outlawed the rejected suitor from the circles of decent royal houses. The princess assumed that the towering oak walls of Polotsk and the heavy axes of her father's retinue would reliably protect her from any consequences her spoken words might trigger. A few weeks later, the ambassadors returned to Vladimir's Novgorodian residence. When they repeat the Polotsk princess's answer word for word, an ice-cold silence hangs over the great hall. Vladimir is around 20 years old. At this age, Scandinavian kings think entirely in categories of status and brutal force. Rogneda's words are not merely a blow to a young man's ego. They are a public declaration of his political bankruptcy. If he swallows this public humiliation and allows a neighboring princess to call him a slave with impunity tomorrow, his own army will turn its back on him. Varangian mercenaries serve only strength, and they absolutely never forgive weakness. But there is another man in the hall for whom this thrown phrase sounds far more terrible than the strike of a sword. Dvina, Vladimir's maternal uncle, the brother of that very same Malusha whose name has just been dragged through the mud. The experienced and utterly ruthless warlord understands perfectly. Such a profound disgrace can only be washed away with blood. Vladimir does not write any diplomatic letters, nor does he send new ambassadors. He orders provisions to be loaded onto the longships, broadaxes to be sharpened, and every single mercenary that can be bought with Novgorodian silver to be assembled. Rogneda had been counting on an elegant diplomatic victory, and was already preparing to try on the crown of a Kievan ruler. But those few words she carelessly threw out did not merely end the negotiations. They forged a monster who is already marching down the western route to turn her entire world into ash. Vladimir had turned about 20 years old, and by this age he had already learned how to do one specific thing better than any of his brother-stake cities by force. The refusal had been delivered. The insult had been dealt publicly. For a Scandinavian leader, to swallow words about being the son of a slave meant absolute political death. The Novgorodian prince did not bother writing reply letters or dispatching fresh messengers. He simply threw open his chests of silver. At the end of the 10th century, the Baltic region was absolutely swarming with professional warriors. Tens of thousands of Varangian mercenaries were actively seeking whoever would pay the most and grant them the right to pillage. Vladimir bought every single mercenary he could possibly reach. He assembled not just an army of vengeance, but a massive international military corporation welded together by a lust for plunder and iron discipline. Back in Polotsk, Rogvolod was still thinking in outdated categories. The old Jarl remained perfectly calm. Behind the towering oak walls of his wooden fortress, one could ride out any storm. Winter is approaching, the forest routes are nearly impassable, and the young bastard will inevitably break his teeth on the sturdy defenses and go home with nothing. But the army that approached the city was not the force of an offended youth. From the dense thicket emerged hardened veterans of countless brutal maritime raids, and those very same walls that Rogvolod had erected for reliable protection were, in an instant, transformed into a gigantic, blazing trap. The storming of a wooden city in the 10th century is entirely devoid of cinematic nobility or months-long truces. It is close-quarters combat, primal fury, and all-consuming fire. The Varangians bring their primary weapon to bear, the broadaxes, heavy battle axes with blades as wide as a man's palm, mounted on long wooden shafts. A single precise strike of such steel easily split not only a thick oak shield, but also the collarbone of a grown man, severing chainmail rings as if they were mere fabric. The air over Polotsk darkened with javelin short throwing spears that pierced the defenders straight through. The sound of this assault did not resemble heroic music. The battle degenerated into a monotonous, deafening crackle of splintering wood, mixed with the screams of hundreds of people and the low, terrifying roar of a spreading inferno. The mercenaries had no need for diplomacy. Vladimir had promised them the absolute right to sack the city, and Polotsk concealed vast storehouses of precious furs, mountains of amber, and thousands of potential slaves. The fire quickly spread to the outer settlements. The flames crawled over the roofs with a heavy roar, greedily devouring the intricately carved pillars of the princely palace. Rogvolod's warband held on to the bitter end, desperately trying to repel the attacks on the ramparts, but the numerical superiority of the attackers was overwhelmingly crushing. The defense line collapsed. The massive oak gates yielded with a violent crack under the relentless blows of battering rams. Blood-crazed mercenaries burst into the city streets. The slaughter begins. But even amidst this sheer chaos, the Varangians strictly execute one ironclad order from their prince: do not touch the ruler's family. In the heat of the carnage, where a human life isn't worth a broken dirham, the armor-clad warriors methodically push back the royal guards and take Rogvolod, his wife, his sons, and Rogneda herself completely alive. The invaders are not stopped by any resistance. They carefully bind the captives and lead them out of the burning palace. Vladimir needs these specific people still breathing. Why did the Novgorodian prince need this highly complex operation to capture them alive? Why did he refuse to simply slaughter his enemies in combat, as the standard logic of war dictated? The true reason lies in who Vladimir is actually challenging.
Sitting in Kyiv is his older brother Yaropolk, the legitimate heir to the throne, and the official fiancé of Rogneda. By burning the incredibly wealthy Polotsk down to ashes, Vladimir is sending Kyiv an absolutely unequivocal signal. I am taking what is supposed to belong to you. Your allies are dead, and you were completely powerless to protect them.
Thick smoke covers the sky above the western Dvina like a heavy shroud. The great commercial hub of Eastern Europe is burning to the ground, turning into desolate ruins. Rogneda stands on the blood-soaked earth, completely surrounded by a tight ring of foreign warriors. Her father, who only yesterday was an all-powerful Scandinavian jarl, has been thrown to his knees with his hands tightly bound. The young woman, who just the day before was absolutely certain of her power over European politics and her divine right to choose crowned husbands, watches in total silence as her entire world crumbles into dust. She stares at the smoldering ashes of her home, fully expecting a swift strike of the sword. Rogneda prepares herself to die with the dignity befitting a princess. But the captive does not yet realize that a quick death would have been the greatest possible gift for her. The city has already fallen. However, in order to definitively seize legitimate power over these lands and trample the honor of Kyiv into the mud, Vladimir needs to break more than just oak walls. He has to break Rogneda herself. And the method the young prince will choose, acting on the advice of his uncle Dobrynya, will make even the most hardened Varangian executioners shudder. The smoke from the fires of Polotsk had not yet settled when the history of Rus took its darkest and most merciless turn. The city had fallen. Its mighty oak walls, which the old Jarl Rogvolod had believed to be impregnable, were reduced to heaps of charred timber. But for the young Princess Rogneda, the true nightmare did not begin when the gates collapsed. It began when two men walked into the hall. The young Vladimir and his uncle, the warlord Dobrynya. The highly experienced warlord Dobrynya was not acting merely as a military commander. He was the blood brother of that very Malusha, the slave housekeeper whose name Rogneda had publicly wiped her feet on in front of the Novgorodian ambassadors just a few weeks prior. The old warrior did not see this as a matter of politics. He saw it as a deeply personal, burning blood insult. In the 10th century, an insult to one's clan was washed away only by the total, catastrophic humiliation of the enemy. Dobrynya thirsted for far more than simply killing Rogvolod. He wanted the old Viking to see, right before he died, how his high birth and the arrogance of his daughter were ground into dust beneath the boots of that very same slave's son. The later chronicle collections, the Laurentian and the Dvur codices, paint a picture that is shocking in its visceral, physiological cruelty. Rogvolod, his wife, and his sons, tightly bound, are thrown to the ground in the center of the palace hall. They are alive. They can see and hear absolutely everything. Dobrynya takes a step forward and utters words that exude the ice-cold calm of an executioner. He advises Vladimir to take Rogneda, right here, right now, directly in front of her father's eyes. Behind this horrific act lay not blind passion, but a highly calculated political ritual of absolute dominance. Within the legal culture of the pagan North, there existed the right of the sword. To take a woman by force on the ashes of her home did not just mean physical violence. It heavily symbolized the complete and total annulment of the legitimacy of her bloodline. Vladimir was not simply taking the girl. He was legally appropriating the rights to Polotsk for himself, tearing them from Rogvolod's hands, along with his daughter's honor. In the thick of this chaos, a crucial detail flashes by, one that historians frequently overlook, but which will become the central key to the princess's entire future life. Torn from Rogneda's chest is a heavy Scandinavian fibula, her mother's silver brooch, the ultimate symbol of her high status and her belonging to the House of Northern Jarls. The jewelry drops onto the blood-soaked floorboards. When it was all over, Rogneda was left alive. But for the world of that era, she had completely ceased to exist as an heir. On Dobrynya's orders, Vladimir commits the final act. He murders Rogvolod and both of the princess's brothers. Rogneda watches the light fade from her father's eyes. In a single night, she has lost her name, her family, her home, and the right to her own body. The chronicler Nestor is suspiciously brief at this exact point. We learn the graphic details of this horror from sources written some 400 years later. It is difficult to judge whether this episode was truly this graphic in reality, or if the scribes of later eras heavily embellished the dark colors to aggressively emphasize Vladimir's bestial nature prior to his Christian baptism. However, the brutal rules of the game in that century dictated their own harsh conditions. Marriage by abduction, becoming a bride of violence, this served as a grim but accepted norm for Varangian kings. Vladimir acted exactly like a classic Viking, ruthlessly clearing the space for his future empire. But Rogneda did not die of grief. When Vladimir and his war band departed from the smoking ruins of Polotsk, dragging the captive away to Kyiv, she found the profound strength within herself to pick up that very same silver fibula of her mother from the floor. She hid it deep within the folds of her clothing. Coursing through her veins was the blood of Rogvolod, man who had come from across the sea and seized power by force. Now, that blood had transformed into an icy, calculating hatred. Vladimir fully believed that he had broken the Polotsk princess, turning her into a silent, defeated trophy. He had no idea yet that he had brought to Kyiv not a submissive wife, but a deeply hidden threat, primed to detonate years later. Rogneda began her own long game, one that would stretch out over a vast period of time. She bore him children, she shared his bed, but every single second of this life, she waited for the exact moment when she could plunge a knife into the heart of the man who had destroyed her world. Vladimir's victory looked completely absolute. Polotsk was erased, Kyiv lay ahead, his enemies trembled. But it was precisely here, built upon the blood of Rogneda's family, that the very first crack appeared in the foundation of his power. Absolute force had birthed an absolute thirst for revenge, and very soon Vladimir would have to learn the hard way that the walls of a harem protect him far worse than chainmail on a battlefield. The chronicler Nestor, working on the pages of the primary chronicle a century later in his quiet monastery cell, preserved a number for us that truly staggers the imagination. He meticulously records 800 concubines. For a 12th century monk, this is not merely a digit, but a direct, deliberate reference to the biblical King Solomon, who possessed the exact same number of women. It is as if the scribe is telling us, look at how bottomless Vladimir's sin appeared before the divine grace of baptism descended upon him. But if we strip away the theology and look strictly at the historical facts, what stands before us is not an oriental fairy tale, but a massive, terrifyingly efficient mechanism for the mass production of heirs. Vladimir captured Kyiv, cold-bloodedly eliminating his final competitor, his older brother Yaropolk, whom the Varangians hoisted on their swords right in the doorway of the palace. Having become the sole, undisputed ruler, he began to perceive Rus as his own personal property, and women as a highly valuable trophy resource. His harem was not located in a single place. It was an entire, sprawling network of settlements distributed across key strategic points around the capital. 300 concubines in Vyshgorod, 300 in Belgorod, and 200 in Berestova. Such a massive enterprise demanded colossal logistical resources, tons of provisions, and hundreds of armed guards and overseers. This was not a palace of earthly pleasures, but a literal assembly line, explicitly designed to populate Rus with sons and heirs, who would later serve as loyal governors in every subjugated city. Within this vast ocean of flesh, Rogneda, the former princess of Polotsk, occupied a highly ambiguous position. Formally, she was considered a lawful pagan wife, but practically, she had become nothing more than a gilded piece of the interior decor.
Vladimir did not bring her to live in his main Kievan palace. For the woman who had publicly called him a slave's son, he had prepared an entirely different fate. Rogneda was settled in an isolated estate on the Lybid River, far removed from the actual center of power. The later chronicles bestow upon her a new name, Gorislava, she who has known grief. This name became both her brand and her refuge. The woman who was just yesterday the heir to a phenomenally wealthy trading hub, whose hand was highly sought after by grand princes, now spent her days waiting for the exceedingly rare visits of her murderer husband, forced to share his attention with hundreds of enslaved captives. Behind the glamorous shine of carved oak, Byzantine silks, and Arabic silver lay a ringing, deafening emptiness. She lived in a world where her voice no longer meant absolutely anything, and her sole, terrible purpose was to give birth to warriors for the exact same man who had wiped her bloodline off the face of the earth. The chronicler is suspiciously brief here. He tries to hurriedly turn the pages past the shameful pagan past of the no-holy prince. But it was precisely in this forced, agonizing isolation on the Lybid that Rogneda launched her own independent game. She did not break. She began to systematically transform her seething hatred into a sharp instrument of upbringing. Vladimir, during this time, was thoroughly enjoying his new status as Kagana grand title he had borrowed from the steppe overlords of Khazaria to explicitly emphasize his total equality with emperors. He firmly believed that the walls of his harem and the pervasive fear of his name reliably protected his peace. 8 years from now, this very man will stand beneath the massive stone walls of Byzantine Chersonesus and arrogantly dictate his will to the entire civilized world. He will fiercely demand the emperor's sister as his wife, laying claim to divine sanctity. But before he takes that monumental step into eternity, his entire world, built purely on violence, will brutally crack. And the person to inflict this crack will be the very same woman he had considered nothing more than a silent, conquered trophy in his vast collection. While the Kagan was drunkenly reveling in his absolute power, deep in the shadows of the Lybid palace, a young boy was already growing up a boy who was destined to become the very first insurmountable obstacle in the path of the great dictator. In the summer of the year 983, a heavy, nauseating smell warned any traveler long before they ever reached their destination. The sickly sweet stench of decomposing blood, heavily mixed with the acrid, choking smoke of burning animal fat. In order to tightly hold together his wildly disparate lands, Vladimir creates something far greater than just an army of mercenaries. The prince desperately requires a unified, monolithic ideological foundation. The former bastard, who seized his throne entirely by the right of the sword, erects a gigantic pagan sanctuary just outside the walls of his palace, a massive site that history would later dub the Blood Pantheon. Descriptions preserved in the primary chronicle allow us to vividly reconstruct the horrifying appearance of this place. In the exact center, towering high above all the others, stood Perun. His figure is not simply a log roughly carved from oak, but a blatant symbol of newfound imperial might. The wooden torso is crowned by a massive head forged of pure silver, sporting a cast gold mustache. The sun, blindingly reflecting off the metal, struck the eyes of anyone who dared to look up. Standing strictly in line around him were the other gods, forcibly gathered from all corners of the subjugated territories: the mysterious Kors, the solar Dazbog, the Lord of the Winds Strybog, the winged dog Simargl, and the single, solitary female figure in this dark assembly, Makosh. Behind the outward, dazzling brilliance of the silver lay the incredibly brutal daily reality of the cult. This sanctuary absolutely did not know quiet, peaceful prayers. The dark bloodstains on the wooden altars never even had time to dry. Sacrifices, massive bulls, wild boars, and bears perished here on an almost daily basis. The earth directly beneath the towering idols had turned into a sticky, black, nightmarish slop, deeply soaked with decades of blood. The constant choking smoke from the raging bonfires, where the pagan priests, the Volks, incinerated the carcasses, hung like a grim burial shroud over the capital city. The Kyiv of that era essentially resembled one endless, terrifyingly solemn slaughterhouse. In its sheer scale, the Kievan sanctuary fiercely rivaled the absolute largest cult centers of Scandinavia, such as Uppsala. There, according to the graphic testimonies of Adam of Bremen, the bodies of dogs, horses, and human beings swung grimly from the branches of trees in the sacred groves. Vladimir was creating something equally monumental, heavily banking on crushing the will of his subjects through the sheer, terrifying majesty of his design. For the Grand Prince, the Pantheon served as a highly calculated instrument of unity. Coming here, a Viatich, a Krivich, or a Radimich tribe member saw their own specific god standing in the common unified ranks, implicitly acknowledging the absolute supremacy of the Kievan prince and his supreme god, Perun. In this way, Vladimir systematically attempted to forge a monolithic, state-sponsored cult, positioning it as a direct counterweight to the powerful Christian shrines of the Byzantines and the Germans. Fierce debates regarding the exact physical location of this sanctuary have not ceased among archaeologists to this very day. In 1975, the researcher Karger excavated a stone foundation on the old Kievan hill, which for a very long time was widely considered to be the very base of the Pantheon. Today, many scholars aggressively dispute this finding, arguing that the stonework is merely the remains of a palace, but the vivid details in the chronicles are simply too naturalistic to be brushed off as mere monastic fantasy. Vladimir firmly believed that this rigid system of offerings and pervasive fear would grant him the power to control the minds of his people for eternity. He personally approved a terrifying procedure where a human sacrifice was chosen by a blind lot, drawn directly from among the free citizens of the city. The prince was convinced that he was keeping the very gods on his payroll, buying their eternal loyalty with other people's blood. However, the rigid system he had built transformed overnight into an uncontrollable, devastating force of nature. When the blind lot eventually falls for the very first time in years, not on an anonymous, nameless captive, but directly on the son of his own elite warrior, all of this silver-headed might will begin to crumble into dust. I am awaiting your approval to proceed to the next module, Mother of Wolves. Within the confines of the palace on the Lybid River, time for Rogneda seemed to freeze completely, turning into a viscous, suffocating emptiness. The former princess of Polotsk, having been forced to accept the name Gorislava, froze like a motionless, unfeeling statue before those around her. In this dark world, her voice was entirely stripped of its weight, and the sole agonizing purpose of her existence became the birth of heirs for the exact man who had wiped her entire bloodline off the face of the earth. But hidden deeply behind this mask of total submission, the ice-cold calculation of a master strategist was maturing. Gorislava absolutely refused to be merely a helpless victim. He actively transformed into a mother of wolves, fully realizing a terrifying truth. Only her own children would become the ultimate weapon that would one day strike a devastating retaliatory blow against Vladimir. Spending her long years in heavy isolation, Rogneda meticulously raised her sons.
The firstborn, Iziaslavl, and the younger, Yaroslav, completely filled her entire universe. However, the rearing of young princes in the harsh 10th century more closely resembled a brutal life in a military encampment. Young boys were torn away from their mothers exceptionally early, handed over to uncles grim, battle-scarred veterans of the warband, whose explicit duty was to violently purge them of any softness and teach them the cold art of killing. Rogneda watched in sheer horror as foreign hands methodically carved exact replicas of their father out of her own children. Desperately trying to salvage their souls, she unleashed a silent, deeply covert war. The princess heavily bribed the old wet nurse, and late at night, while the Varangian tutors were fast asleep, a completely different kind of whisper echoed over the cradles. Little Iziaslavl was not told glorious tales of Vladimir's grand triumphs, but rather of the majestic greatness of his grandfather Rogvolod, the fierce independence of Polotsk, and the devastating flames that completely swallowed their ancestral home. Drop by painstaking drop, Rogneda poured this Polotsk poison directly into the impressionable consciousness of the future generation of the Rurik dynasty. The official chronicles frequently bypass one glaring physical detail. Yaroslav, the future grand ruler of Rus, walked with a heavy limp from the very moment of his birth. In the unforgiving, brutally utilitarian world of the Vikings, physical infirmity served as a dark brand, easily capable of becoming an absolute death sentence for a child. But it was precisely here that the very first noticeable crack appeared in the impenetrable armor of Vladimir's pagan beast persona. The great Kagan, who effortlessly made entire neighboring tribes tremble in fear, would lay down his heavy sword and clumsily, awkwardly, attempt to teach his crippled son how to hold his step. In these exceedingly rare moments, what stood before Rogneda was not a ruthless dictator, but a deeply confused, vulnerable father confronted by his own powerlessness. The princess meticulously noted these fleeting moments of weakness and understood perfectly. The monster was vulnerable, but her burning hatred ultimately proved to be far stronger than any fleeting sense of pity. Her unbroken, fiercely resilient spirit was physically embodied by the silver Scandinavian fibula, the very brooch, violently torn from her on the horrifying night Polotsk fell. Rogneda aggressively guards it like a sacred relic, hiding it deep within a narrow crack under the heavy floorboards of the palace. In the dead of night, the cold, sharp gleam of that silver relentlessly pulled her back to the reality of who she truly was before she was reduced to being the mere trophy of a slave son. While the Kagan drunkenly reveled in his supreme power, growing up in the deep shadows of his harem were young boys whose very first sword in life would be forged entirely from their mother's seething hatred. Rogneda knew with absolute certainty, sooner or later, Vladimir would make a fatal mistake, opening a clear path for the knife she kept meticulously hidden beneath her pillow. Vladimir truly believed that the high walls of his harem and the pervasive atmosphere of fear reliably guarded his peace. He hoped to dictate the world forever, having purchased the favor of his gods with copious amounts of foreign blood. But the terrifying machine of terror he had constructed was already violently mutating into an uncontrollable force of nature. In the summer of 983, the prince returns to Kyiv in absolute triumph, and his pagan priests demand something he had never dared to permit before. The blind lot is cast to point to the next human sacrifice. And when the wooden token bearing the name hits the dirt, the entire city freezes in sheer terror. The gods have chosen the exact people who were absolutely never meant to be touched. The heavy doors in Rogneda's palace violently swing open. The time of the bloody lot has come. The year 983. Kyiv is aggressively celebrating the triumphant return of its warband from a brutal, exhausting campaign against the Varangian tribes. But the city's festive energy is deeply poisoned by a sticky, terrifying premonition. You walk through the bustling market. You politely greet your neighbors, but you instinctively avert your eyes. Every single person knows the grim truth. Tonight, someone is going to die on the altar, not from a sudden illness, nor in honest combat, but specifically chosen by a blind, unforgiving lot in the name of the new gods up on the hill. This year marked the absolute highest pinnacle of triumph for the young Vladimir. He had definitively cemented his iron grip on the Kievan throne, violently pacified the rebellious tribes, and hauled back massive amounts of rich loot from the dark forests of the Baltics. Vladimir profoundly views himself as a pagan and earthly overlord whose sovereign will is inextricably bound to the will of the heavens.
To permanently solidify this elite status, he erected the Blood Pantheon, towering over the Dnieper River, featuring Perun directly in the center. The massive oak torso, the silver head, and the gold mustache flawlessly embodied raw state power, entirely purchased at the high price of fratricide and the brutal violation of Rogneda. But the elaborate system Vladimir had built ruthlessly dictated its own rigid rules, rules that refused to obey even him. As the victorious army proudly marched into Kyiv, the pagan priests, the Volks, stepped out to meet the prince with an absolute ultimatum. Their theological logic was striking in its ice-cold cruelty. The gods have granted you a great victory. Now the gods demand their rightful share. In the deeply transactional pagan worldview, military success was essentially a business deal, where every single victorious battle was ultimately paid for in human blood. The demand of the priest was absolutely not a polite request. It served as a direct, highly public test of the Khagan's own political legitimacy. Vladimir himself had carefully conditioned the masses to believe that his supreme authority was divinely sanctioned by Perun. To refuse them now meant publicly confessing that he was not the master of these wooden idols, but merely their hostage. The dark ritual of human sacrifice in Kievan Rus strongly mirrored the terrifying rites of northern Scandinavian centers like Uppsala. Just as the lifeless bodies of victims swayed from the branches in Swedish sacred groves, the Kievan sanctuary fiercely demanded regular, bloody feedings. This time, the priests aggressively insisted on a highly specific offering. The lot had to fall specifically on a beautiful youth or maiden chosen directly from the ranks of the free citizens of the city. To conduct the ritual, they utilized lots, small wooden planks marked with carved notches, which were vigorously mixed inside a metal helmet and drawn out entirely blind. This chilling process deeply symbolized the incomprehensible sovereign will of the gods, before whom both the lowest slave and the most noble warrior were completely equal. Vladimir officially authorized the casting of the lot, heavily banking on tightening his grip over the minds of the populace through collective, paralyzing fear. The prince saw this entirely as a political instrument, one highly capable of welding the city's population into a single, utterly submissive mass. The dictator firmly believed that he was successfully using the gods as his own personal political resource. However, on that specific night, the blind lot stopped serving the authorities. When the wooden plank bearing the chosen name finally hit the ground, the pagan priests froze, and a low whisper swiftly tore through the massive crowd, rapidly escalating into a furious, roaring hum. The gods had explicitly chosen Ioan. This was not some anonymous, disposable captive. This was the son of Theodora, highly noble Varangian, a deeply respected veteran of the princely war band, a man who had served for many years in the Byzantine Empire and had returned to Kyiv surrounded by an impenetrable aura of wealth and martial glory. Blind chance had struck a devastating blow right into the very heart of the prince's military elite. The exact system that Vladimir had meticulously created to violently suppress his enemies, suddenly and aggressively demanded the blood of his own absolute best warrior. Rogneda, intently listening to the frightened whispers of her maids in her isolated estate on the Lybid, understood immediately. The ironclad order of her tormentor husband had just suffered its very first, incredibly deep fracture. The priests, heavily escorted by a heavily armed, furious mob, marched directly toward Fyodor's wealthy estate. They did not yet realize that this hardened Varangian veteran, who had seen the dazzling splendor of Constantinople with his own eyes, had absolutely no intention of bowing down to the laws of wooden idols. The heavy oak doors of the timber palace in the Podil district are tightly locked. The absolute moment of choice has arrived. Hand over your own son to be slaughtered, or declare an all-out, one-man war against Vladimir's entire pagan empire. That night, the entire city of Kyiv held its breath. The only sound piercing the heavy silence was the priests vigorously mixing the wooden planks inside a metal helmet, and every single clack of wood against metal violently struck the ears of the tense crowd. Vladimir watched this process unfold from the high elevation of his palace, supremely confident that the gods would obediently play by his rules. He viewed the drawing of the lot as a mere formality, designed purely to reaffirm his absolute power over the lives of his subjects. But when the priest's hand pulled out the plank and the name Ioan rang out, the air over the hill seemed to freeze completely solid. The lot had not fallen on a nameless slave, nor on a captured foreigner. The gods had chosen the son of Theodora, high-ranking Varangian noble, an elite veteran of the prince's own retinue, who had served for many years in Byzantium and returned to Kyiv wrapped in an aura of vast wealth and unquestionable military glory. However, this divine choice instantly turned into a lethal political paradox. Fyodor openly and proudly practiced Christianity, while the bloody altars of Perun smoked heavily on the hills of Kyiv. An entirely different world already thrived down in the Podil district. Historical chronicles explicitly mention the cathedral church of St. Elijah sanctuary, where Christian Varangians routinely prayed to their own god. Fyodor belonged to the absolute elite of this community. The blood of northern conquerors flowed through his veins, but his heart had been given entirely to Constantinople. Inside Fyodor's grand house, the atmosphere belongs to an entirely different century. While the angry torches flare up violently in the streets outside, inside it smells of sweet olive oil burning in a Byzantine lampada. On the wall hangs the strict, solemn face of a painted icon, and resting against the warrior's chest is a heavy cross of solid gold. His son Ioan, beautiful in face and soul, does not yet know that outside thousands of crazed people are already demanding his brutal death as the price for the prince's military triumph. Try to put yourself directly in the shoes of this father. You have shed your blood for your ruler for years. You have earned high honor and vast wealth. And now, the exact same system that you vigorously protected with your own shield is demanding your one and only treasure, your son. What is an oath of loyalty truly worth in such a terrifying moment? Would you humbly submit to the will of the furious majority, or would you violently rebel against the entire city? Tell me what you think about this in the comments below. Theodore did not wait for the mob to violently smash down the doors of his home. He stepped out onto the high wooden gallery of his grand house, his hand resting out of sheer habit on the hilt of his heavy sword. The veteran's cold gaze swept right over the heads of the violently raging crowd. The pagan priests loudly shouted their demands, constantly citing the unyielding will of the gods. But the Varangian answered with words that echoed like thunder across the entire Podol district. These are not gods, but mere wood. Today they are here, and tomorrow they will rot away. I will not give my son to demons. This was absolutely not just a simple refusal. These words rang out as an explicit declaration of total ideological warfare. Theodore publicly and devastatingly humiliated Vladimir's bloody pantheon, labeling the Khagan's supreme gods as nothing more than ordinary rotting logs. The massive crowd froze in absolute shock, and then their fury violently erupted with renewed, terrifying force. The deafening roar of the fanatics completely drowned out the sound of the Dnieper River crashing against the shore. Up in his palace, Vladimir received the urgent news of the Varangians' rebellion and realized he was trapped in a political snare. To intervene and save Theodore meant officially admitting the weakness of his own gods and completely destroying his own authority. To allow the murder to happen meant destroying the absolute best officer of his own elite guard with his own hands. Rogneda, locked away in her estate on the Lybid River, listened intently to the dull roar echoing from the city and felt a bottomless abyss beginning to open up right beneath Vladimir's feet. She understood clearly what the prince could not yet see. The absolute, unchecked force he so heavily relied upon had just birthed an absolute, unyielding resistance. Hundreds of flaming torches surged rapidly toward Theodore's grand estate. A brutal siege commenced, one in which there would be absolutely no winners. Ahead lay a horrifying night where the blinding fire of fanaticism would violently clash with the immovable stone of faith, and a young boy with a sword in his hands on the other side of the city would fully realize, for the very first time, the true meaning of a blood feud. The dry, intensely monotonous thud of swinging axes loudly echoes over Kyiv, completely overpowering the deafening roar of the multi-thousand-strong mob. It is not skilled carpenters erecting a new palace here, nor is it lumberjacks diligently preparing firewood for the harsh winter rite before the eyes of the entire city. A deeply methodical, gruesome execution of the year 983 is taking place. Rogneda froze entirely at the narrow window of her timber palace on the Lybid River. From the deep shadows of her forced confinement, she vividly sees the crimson glow heavily hanging over the Podil district. The city is violently boiling over with religious fanaticism. The princess cannot see their faces, but she can feel this collective madness in her very bones. Down there, in the Podil, stands the incredibly wealthy estate of the Varangian Theodore. The massive log structure, featuring high sweeping galleries, rests firmly on gigantic oak pillars. Theodore is a hardened veteran, a man who has witnessed the dazzling brilliance of Constantinople and firmly chosen the White Christ over the bloody, terrifying idols of his warlord. And right now, the massive crowd, which Vladimir had spent years carefully conditioning to crave the smell of sacrificial blood, has come to forcefully rip away his life and the life of his son Ioan. At this exact same time, sitting in his princely hall, Vladimir Sviatoslavich sits listening to the exact same rhythmic thudding. But for him, this specific sound violently transforms from a hymn of triumph into a terrifying death sentence. On this fateful night, a monumental tectonic shift violently occurs within the mind of the dictator. The highly calculating strategist, who had spent years systematically building a vertical hierarchy of fear on the old Kievan hill, suddenly sees the grotesque underbelly of his own manufactured greatness.
The bloody Pantheon, which he had explicitly designed to be an obedient, submissive political tool, has violently mutated into an uncontrollable, ravenous beast. The impending murder of his own absolute best elite warrior physically demonstrates a deeply terrifying truth to Vladimir. The mob, completely intoxicated by the heavy stench of sacrificial blood, no longer requires his orders. Previously, paganism had served the Kagan as a reliable currency, one he used to purchase the fragile unity of the disparate tribes. He firmly believed that Perun, with his gleaming silver head, was nothing more than a convenient ideological barrier. But the blind lot, having fallen directly on his loyal Varangian, aggressively erased all the rules. Vladimir profoundly realizes a system built entirely on blood absolutely does not recognize the concept of loyalty. Today it has ruthlessly devoured Theodore, and tomorrow, operating on that exact same blind, unyielding logic, it will inevitably come for him. The mob does not foolishly rush to batter down the heavy oak doors. They act in a much more cunning and terrifying manner. Hundreds of men wielding heavy axes violently swarm the massive, load-bearing pillars of the grand house. Cutting through the cold night air, the loud, sickening crunch of violently tearing wood directly reaches Rogneda's ears. The Slavs and Varangians, highly experienced in felling the dense forests, methodically hack away at the very heels of the structure. With every single devastating blow, the massive building, which flawlessly embodied the great wealth and high status of its own, violently shudders. It deeply resembles a living, breathing creature that they are brutally attempting to cut down at the very root. Rogneda steps away from the narrow window and slowly sits down on the very edge of a wooden bench. Gripped tightly in her hands is a heavy, razor-sharp hunting knife. In the dead silence of her chamber, the harsh scrape of cold metal against a sharpening stone perfectly merges with the rhythmic thudding of the axes down in the pottle. The princess feels absolutely no pity for Theodore. In her violently shattered world, which was completely scorched by the fires of Polotsk, that particular emotion had completely atrophied a long time ago. She understands perfectly. Vladimir is rapidly losing control. The princess sees in her husband's eyes not his usual bestial confidence, but total, paralyzing confusion. He is wounded, and this deep wound is not on his physical body, but at the very core essence of his absolute power. A deafening, catastrophic crack echoes from the Podol's massive wooden pillars finally surrender. The structural supports have been completely shattered. The heavy, two-story structure, rapidly losing its balance, begins to lean precariously and violently collapses in on itself, burying both the father and the son alive beneath the crushing debris. The screams of the raging mob instantly transform into a terrifying, triumphant roar. Rogneda slowly runs her finger along the blade of the hunting knife. It is razor-sharp. The Pantheon upon the hill is heavily drenched in blood,
but it remains entirely silent. Rogneda remains silent as well, carefully slipping the heavy knife underneath her pillow. She knows the truth. When a tyrant is truly terrified, he instinctively seeks out the one person who fully shares his own dark nature of violence. Vladimir always, inevitably, returns to her after shedding a massive amount of blood, desperately hoping to find a clear reflection of his own dark soul in her ice-cold silence. Vladimir fiercely steers his horse toward her isolated estate, completely unaware that he is riding directly toward the final, violent climax of his pagan life. The dictator is desperately searching for a way out of the dead end that he himself constructed, failing to understand that this exit lies directly across the sharp edge of a blade.
Kyiv holds its breath, silently waiting for the very first deep crack in the foundation of the empire to violently transform into an absolutely crushing fault line. The night inside the isolated estate on the Lybid River is heavily saturated with dampness, the foul stench of lake slime and the thick, choking smoke of burning oil lamps. The chamber is oppressively stuffy, the small, mica-paneled windows reflecting the dim, dying flicker of the wooden splinters refuse to let in even a single breath of fresh air. Vladimir arrived very late. Without even bothering to remove his heavy armor, the prince violently threw his heavy cloak, soaking wet from the road mud, onto a wooden bench. Rogneda intensely watched his face in the unsteady, flickering light of the fire. It was the face of a man who had profoundly realized that his old gods no longer belonged to him. The dictator fruitlessly sought oblivion in the exact place where nothing but pure, unadulterated hatred awaited him. He collapsed heavily onto a bed stuffed with fresh straw and closed his eyes. But the warlord princes of that brutal era did not know the concept of serene, peaceful sleep. Violent death had stalked right behind them for far too long to allow them the luxurious vulnerability of oblivion. Vladimir sleeps incredibly lightly, instinctively catching every single rustle, the cracking of cooling timber, the distant, mournful howling of dogs down in the podil, and the heavy, measured breathing of his wife. Rogneda is not sleeping. Frozen perfectly still in the deep shadows, just beyond the boundary of the light, her fingers blindly trace the freezing cold hilt of the heavy hunting knife. The princess has waited exactly 8 long years for this exact moment. Burning vividly in her memory is the complete destruction of Polotsk. She vividly hears the agonizing screams of her dying brothers and sees the fading light in her father's eyes. To the outside world, she is merely Gorislava, a deeply submissive concubine locked away in the Kievan harem. But hidden securely beneath the rich Byzantine silk on her chest is the silver Scandinavian fibula, that exact same heavy brooch she pulled from the pool of blood in the violently destroyed palace of Rogvolod. This piece of metal is her true, authentic identity, and it serves as her absolute death sentence for him. The princess slowly rises to her feet, trying her utmost not to disturb the dry straw in the mattress. She silently creeps closer to the sleeping dictator. Right now, Vladimir does not look anything like the terrifying, all-powerful Kagan. He is just a vulnerable mortal man whose ironclad order violently collapsed after the bloody massacre at Theodore's estate. He is totally exposed. His chest rises and falls with measured breathing. One single precise strike, and the blood of Rogvolod will finally achieve its absolute vengeance.
Rogneda raises the heavy knife high into the air, a sharp, violent crunch of crushed straw. Vladimir snaps his eyes open instantly. Gleaming in the dark is not only her sharp blade, but also his gaze, ice cold and burning with pure fury. The prince violently intercepts his wife's wrist a mere fraction of a second before the lethal strike lands. A brief, desperate struggle ensues in the deep gloom. The heavy knife drops violently onto the wooden floorboards with a loud, ringing clatter. Vladimir leaps to his feet, violently throwing her away from him. A terrifying silence violently descends upon the chamber, where the only sound is their heavy, ragged breathing and the foul stench of burning fat. According to the right of the sword, this specific action demands immediate, brutal death. Vladimir possesses the absolute right to slaughter her right here and right now, and absolutely no one in Kyiv would ever dare to condemn him for it. He stares directly at her, and in his cold eyes, Rogneda sees absolutely no fear, but rather a burning, seething rage. The prince profoundly realizes, for all these long years, he has been sleeping with his head resting on the chest of his own executioner. Vladimir does not pick up the dropped knife. He takes a slow step back and utters words that land with far greater weight than any physical death sentence. He will not kill her in a blind fit of rage, like some common enemy. The prince violently transforms her impending death into a dark, ritualistic conclusion of their brutal marriage. "Put on your wedding clothes," he hisses through clenched teeth, "the exact ones you wore when I took you in Polotsk. Prepare yourself and wait for me right here, on this bed. I will return at the crack of dawn, and I will execute you myself, exactly as befits a princess." He abruptly turns and leaves, his heavy leather boots violently thudding down the wooden stairs. The heavy door violently slams shut, leaving Rogneda in absolute silence. Dropping heavily to her knees, the princess slowly opens her chest. She has only a few short hours left. She pulls out the rich Byzantine silks, heavily embroidered with gold thread, the heavy silver necklaces, and that very same fibula of her mother. Gorislava is meticulously preparing for her absolute final role, the role of the bride of violence, who will finally attain her ultimate freedom through the embrace of death. She does not yet know that the coming dawn will not bring the lethal strike of a heavy sword, but rather something that Vladimir could absolutely never have foreseen. Awakening in the deep shadows of the palace was the one who had absorbed the Polotsk poison entirely too deeply. A freezing, slate-gray dawn violently cuts through the thick, heavy fog that has completely swallowed the outlines of Kyiv, and the choking stench of the cooling ashes down in the Podil. An absolute deathly silence has frozen inside Rogneda's chamber. Even the terrified servants do not dare to break it. The princess stands perfectly frozen in the exact center of the great hall. In the unsteady, ghostly light of the early morning, it seems as though time has violently reversed itself. Rogneda is fully adorned in those exact same wedding clothes in which she had stepped out to fiercely face the Varangians in Polotsk exactly 8 years ago. The incredibly heavy Byzantine silk, richly embroidered with thick gold threads, felt freezing cold against her skin. Hanging heavily on her chest, her silver necklaces and large temple rings dimply reflect the light. Once their cheerful ringing promised immense happiness. Now they sound the grim herald of her impending death. But the most crucial detail stands out. The old Scandinavian fibula, which had spent years hidden away securely under the floorboards. Now, the heavy brooch is openly and proudly pinned directly to her dress. This is a blatant, defiant manifesto. Standing before us is no longer Gorislava, the one who has known grief, the heavily subdued concubine of the Kagan. By the break of dawn, she has forcefully reclaimed her true name, Rogneda Rogvolodovna. The heavy, violent thud of boots on the wooden stairs aggressively forces the princess to straighten her back. The heavy door violently flies open from the brutal kick of a heavy boot. Vladimir strides into the room entirely alone. Having swapped out his battle armor for a grand ceremonial cloak, he appears with a face seemingly carved from solid stone. The sleepless, agonizing night has left its incredibly heavy mark upon him. Clutched tightly in his fist is a fully drawn, naked sword.
Operating entirely under the right of the sword, the prince has come to carry out a brutal, ritualistic execution for the attempted assassination of the warlord. He takes a deliberate step forward, raising the heavy steel blade high. Rogneda absolutely refuses to look away. She patiently waits for the devastating strike that is ready to place the final period on her long drawn-out game of vengeance. Suddenly, from the deep shadows of the room, a place where Vladimir had not even bothered to cast a glance, the incredibly sharp ringing of metal abruptly rings out. Stepping directly between the father and the mother is a small, incredibly fragile figure. Standing right before the prince is his firstborn son, Iziaslavl, a young boy who perfectly united the violently clashing blood of two permanently warring dynasties within his veins. He can barely keep himself upright under the immense weight of the weapon, but tightly clutched in his small hands is a real, heavy steel sword. Archaeologists regularly find such specialized items in the ancient burial grounds of Gnezdovo and Shestovica, shortened, scaled-down blades expertly forged specifically for the martial training of young princes. The young child grips the heavy hilt tightly with both of his hands, and the sharp steel blade trembles wildly, catching the very first rays of the rising sun. The little boy utters a single, devastating phrase, meticulously preserved by the chronicler Nestor through the centuries. "Father, do you think you are here alone?" Contained entirely within these chilling words is not a childish threat, but a catastrophic death sentence for an entire old epoch. Vladimir freezes completely solid. In this exact fraction of a second, the dictator's entire accustomed worldview violently collapses inside his mind. Staring at his own son, who had deeply absorbed the Polotsk poison along with his mother's lullabies, he vividly sees his own exact reflection. The Grand Prince profoundly realizes an incredibly terrifying truth, one completely inaccessible to his Viking ancestors. The right of the strong is an endless, viciously closed circle. If he brutally murders the mother right before the eyes of the son, Iziaslavl will be absolutely obligated by the unbreakable law of blood vengeance to murder his own father, and Iziaslavl's son will have to murder Yaroslavl's son. The blood will continue to pour endlessly until the entire Rurik dynasty violently exterminates itself completely. The horrifying massacre down in the Padil had already definitively proven the old bloody gods absolutely no longer guarantee any sort of order. They generate nothing but uncontrollable chaos. Vladimir slowly lowers his arm. The incredibly heavy sword falls onto the thick oak floorboards with a loud, ringing clatter. The all-powerful god Kagan, who effortlessly made entire nations tremble in fear, steps back entirely in the face of a child's gaze. In this exact minute, standing on the Lybid River, an insurmountable, catastrophic fault line violently tears completely through the foundational bedrock of pagan Rus. The prince slowly turns around and walks out in total silence. Rogneda's death would have guaranteed the total destruction of his own future, but leaving her securely by his side is equally impossible. The hidden knife under the pillow will forever prevent him from closing his eyes. Vladimir makes a monumental decision. He will permanently exile his wife and son far away from Kyiv. Right on the very border of the Polotsk lands, a brand new city will be built specifically for them, Iziaslavl. A solitary, incredibly lonely wagon train slowly departs toward the freezing north. The heavy runners of the sleighs squeak loudly, and thick clouds of steam violently erupt from the horses' nostrils. Rogneda heavily wraps herself in thick furs, clutching her son incredibly tightly to her chest. Right before the departure, she carries out one final, highly symbolic gesture. She unpins the heavy silver fibula from her own chest and decisively pins it directly onto Iziaslavl's cloak. "This is yours," she aggressively whispers. "You will remember exactly who you are." Vladimir was left completely alone inside his vast, empty timber palace. The massive Pantheon on the hill, heavily drenched in the blood of Christian martyrs, remained completely and utterly silent. His sprawling harem, consisting of hundreds of captive women, now elicited nothing but a deep, nauseating disgust. The Kagan profoundly realized the old world had violently died this very night. A terrified messenger timidly knocked on the heavy wooden doors. "My prince, the ambassadors have officially arrived. From the Bulgars, the Khazars, the Germans, and the Greeks. They all intensely wish to speak with you about God." Vladimir slowly raised his head. Left in his cold gaze was absolutely no more fury, only a desperate burning thirst to find a new law that would ultimately prove to be vastly stronger than the edge of a sword. The ultimate fate of Rogneda stands as a profound, incredible paradox of survival. A woman who was violently stripped of absolutely everything in the roaring flames of Polotsk successfully managed to transform her seething hatred into the single, solitary weapon highly capable of fully stopping a terrifying dictator. She achieved her ultimate victory not on the night when she raised a hunting knife over her sleeping husband, but in the exact second when she deeply embedded that knife directly into the consciousness of her own son. Vladimir did not back down out of any sense of mercy or pity in the small, fragile figure of Iziaslavl. He vividly saw the exact mirror image of himself and profoundly realized the law of blood will inevitably, completely devour its own creator. This monumental family schism completely laid bare a terrifying truth. A sprawling empire that has grown entirely upon the sheer right of the strong is fundamentally doomed to eternal, bloody civil war. Princess Olga had previously attempted to violently pacify the chaos with organized taxes, but only Vladimir, having directly collided with the violent rebellion of his own family and the absolute madness of the Kievan mob, truly understood. A great state deeply requires not just ironclad military discipline, but a single, unified soul. The blood of the Varangians Theodore and John, brutally spilled down in the Podil, served as the definitive boundary line beyond which the old gods of war permanently and entirely lost their absolute power over Rus. The break of dawn over the mighty Dnieper River catches Vladimir entirely alone in his completely deserted palace. The massive silver head of Perrin continues to gleam blindingly with its golden mustache, but the wooden idol maintains a completely dead,
empty silence. The Grand Prince steps out onto his high wooden porch to personally meet the waiting ambassadors, thoroughly understanding. In order to truly save his crown, he will have to violently break his own brutal nature and decisively choose a new faith that will securely bind Rus with the rest of the civilized world. However, the long, arduous path to the Christian baptism will violently turn out to be not a peaceful, quiet sermon, but a protracted, brutal military siege and an incredibly high-stakes geopolitical thriller. In the very next episode, Anastas, the Byzantine Gambit, we will violently march directly to the massive stone walls of Chersonesus. You will learn exactly how the treacherous betrayal of a single Greek official will definitively decide the ultimate fate of all of Eastern Europe, exactly why Vladimir will ruthlessly cut off the water supply to the starving, besieged city, and exactly why the Byzantine princess Anna will publicly label this dynastic marriage a direct, one-way road straight into hell. Subscribe to the channel. The grand saga of the Christianization of Kiev and Rus is only just gathering its true strength.